They thought they were just making another arrest. But when they walked into court weeks later, they never expected the woman in the judge's seat to be her. It all started on a quiet sunny afternoon in Fort Collins, Colorado. The park was alive, kids laughing in the distance, joggers passing by, families spread out on blankets under the oak trees. And right there, by the edge of the pond, a black woman named Camille sat alone on a bench, lost in the pages of a thick hardcover book. She was a respected attorney, the kind of woman who rarely took a break, and today, this was her one moment of peace. Then came the sound that broke it all, tires screeching. A police cruiser pulled up to the curb, grabbing attention from nearby parkgoers. Two officers stepped out, their body language loud, serious, confident, already scanning. Their eyes locked on Camille, the only person sitting alone nearby. "Ma'am, can we talk to you for a moment?" one called out, his tone less about safety, more about suspicion. Camille looked up, unbothered. "Of course," she said calmly, carefully closing her book. The second officer stepped forward. "We got a call about suspicious activity. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" She raised an eyebrow. "Suspicious? I'm just reading," she said, holding up the book like evidence. But they didn't back off. "Can we see some ID?" the first officer pressed. Camille felt her heart beat a little faster but kept her composure. "What's the reason for this?" "It's just routine," one replied, though everything about the interaction said otherwise. A small crowd had started to gather now, some watching with curiosity, others clearly uncomfortable. Camille could feel the shift in the air. Still, she reached into her bag, pulled out her wallet, and handed over her license. The officer studied it a little too long. "Camille Johnson," he read slowly, with a hint of sarcasm. "What's your business here, Ms. Johnson?" She took a breath. "I live here. I'm enjoying the park." "Is that not allowed?" Instead of letting her be, they kept pressing. Asking questions that didn't feel procedural, they felt personal. "Do you always carry a book like that?" one sneered. "Are you waiting for someone?" the other added, his hand resting near his belt in a deliberate way. Camille had been in intense courtroom battles. She knew power plays. But this was different. She could feel the shift, a familiar, chilling undertone. Still, she kept her ground. "I won't answer anything else unless you tell me what I'm being accused of." And that's when things turned. "Don't get smart with us," one snapped. "I know the law," Camille said, her voice steady. "And I'm not breaking it by sitting in a public park." But logic wasn't on their agenda. Without warning, one officer reached for her arm. "You're resisting," he said, even though she hadn't moved. "What are you doing?" she gasped, shocked. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A man pulled out his phone, recording. "Stop resisting," the officer shouted, louder now, for the audience. And then came the cold click of metal. Handcuffs locked around her wrists. Her pulse raced, but she stayed calm, even as a storm of anger and humiliation built inside her. They marched her to the cruiser, ignoring the crowd's questions. Camille turned her head, locking eyes with a young woman holding up her phone. A silent exchange passed between them, a plea to not let this moment disappear. But as the car door slammed shut, Camille knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. In the back of that cruiser, her mind raced. She'd spent years standing for justice, defending the innocent, fighting for truth. Now she was living what too many had described to her. The irony was brutal. But there was no humor here. Only heat in her chest, and steel around her wrists. At the station, things only got worse. The booking process felt like it was designed to break her, the fingerprints, the mugshot, the way they spoke to her. "Enjoy your stay," one officer smirked as they shut the cell door. She sat in the corner of that holding cell, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, hands tight in her lap. And in that silence, she played it all back, frame by frame. But she also made a decision. Because the next time she saw those officers, they weren't wearing badges. They were standing in front of her bench, the same woman they tried to humiliate, now wearing the robe of the judge who would decide their fate. She replayed it over and over. How did a peaceful afternoon turn into this nightmare? The answer was bitter but clear: prejudice. Hours passed in silence before anyone acknowledged her. Finally, a young officer showed up at her cell, clipboard in hand. "Miss Johnson, you've been charged with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer," he said flatly. Camille's voice cut through the air, sharper than she intended. "On what grounds?" "You can discuss that in court," he replied coldly, already walking away. She exhaled, forcing herself to stay strategic. The charges were weak, she knew that. But she also knew the battle ahead wouldn't be simple. It never was, not for cases like hers. Later that night, she was released on bail. As she stepped outside, the cool air slapped against her skin, a stark contrast to the heat and tension inside that station. Near the curb, her friend and colleague Marissa was waiting. "Camille." Marissa rushed forward, her face a blend of relief and anger. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Camille said, but her slight tremble betrayed her. As they drove through the quiet streets, Marissa kept glancing her way, waiting. Finally, Camille broke the silence. "I'm not letting this slide. Not this time." Marissa tightened her grip on the steering wheel. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I'm tired. Tired of this happening again and again," Camille said. "I've got the knowledge, the tools, the resources. And I'm going to fight back." That same night, Camille sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by legal pads and thick books. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with focused fury. She was building a civil rights lawsuit against the officers and the department. And as days turned into weeks, something powerful began to happen. The video, recorded by the young woman in the park, had gone viral. Messages began pouring in. People shared their own stories, their own pain, their own rage. Camille realized this wasn't just about her anymore. Every email, every call, every comment strengthened her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for her dignity, she was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or wrongly accused. But the road wasn't easy. Her law firm hesitated at first, worried that the publicity could damage their image. But Camille stood her ground. Calm, but firm. "This isn't just about me," she said. "It's about setting a precedent." The video had already sparked a conversation, not just in her city, but across the country. The image of Camille, calm, dignified, being led away in cuffs, became a symbol of quiet resistance, of resilience. Reporters came knocking. Interview requests flooded in. But Camille said no to all of them. She wasn't chasing headlines. She was building a case. Not just against two officers, but against the system that let this happen in the first place. And yet, even with all her strength, the weight crept in at night. In the quiet, she replayed it, the tone of their voices, the handcuffs, the hum of fluorescent lights, the silent crowd. And the thought that haunted her most: it could have gone so much worse. One evening, as she dug through legal documents, Marissa showed up with takeout. "You've been at this for hours," she said gently. "I don't have a choice," Camille replied, eyes never leaving the screen. Marissa sat across from her. "You know this is bigger than just a legal fight, right? People are looking to you now." Camille finally looked up. "I know," she said quietly. "That's why I can't afford to lose." Her case preparation was flawless. She dug into legal precedents, poked holes in the officer's report, and assembled a team of attorneys who shared her fire. But Camille didn't just hide in books. She showed up for her community. Town halls, forums, college panels. She listened. She spoke. She stood up. One afternoon, after a meeting, a stranger stopped her in the parking lot. "Miss Johnson," the woman asked softly. "Yes?" "I just wanted to say thank you for standing up. For all of us." Camille's throat tightened. She smiled gently. I'm just doing what I can. The support fueled her, but it also came with pressure. She couldn't fail, not just for herself, but for the voices now echoing behind her. Then, one day, her attorney called. The officers she was suing, the officers had filed a motion to dismiss the case. Camille wasn't surprised. It was a predictable move, a standard tactic meant to delay accountability. She listened as her attorney walked her through the next steps, her focus steady, until he paused. Camille, he said gently, his tone shifting. There's something else you need to know. She leaned in, sensing the weight of his words. You've just been assigned as the presiding judge for one of their cases next month. For a moment, time slowed. Camille sat back in her chair, stunned. After everything, after the arrest, the humiliation, the sleepless nights building a case, fate had flipped the script. She had been preparing to face these officers as a plaintiff. But now, she would sit above them, on the bench, as the judge deciding their future. The irony was almost too much to process. Could she be fair? Could she stay impartial? She asked herself the question honestly. Then she thought about the crowd that had watched in silence. About the woman who filmed the arrest. About the people who had sent messages, shared their pain, and placed their hopes in her. This wasn't just coincidence. It was something bigger, a moment to demonstrate what real justice looked like. When the day arrived, the courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation. People filed in, whispering to one another, filling the seats for what would normally be a routine misconduct hearing. But this wasn't routine. Not anymore. The case involved two officers, Carter and Daniels, facing internal charges of excessive force in a separate incident. Nothing about it had drawn public attention, until now. At the defense table, Carter and Daniels sat in uniform, straight-backed and unbothered, speaking to each other in low tones. To them, it was just another box to check, another hearing to get through. Then the door to the judge's chambers opened, and silence fell like a curtain. Camille entered, her black robe trailing behind her like the weight of the moment itself. She walked with purpose. Authority. Her face calm, unreadable, as she stepped up to the bench and took her seat. Only then did she look at the defendants. The effect was immediate. Officer Carter's face went pale. His mouth tightened. His eyes widened in disbelief. Daniels shifted in his seat, clearly rattled. It was her. The same woman they arrested in the park. The one they never expected to see again, let alone like this. Camille let a short pause settle over the room. Just long enough for the gravity to register. Then, in a clear, composed voice, she spoke. This court is now in session. Please be seated. The officers sat stiffly, their posture rigid, their confidence already beginning to crack. Carter leaned over and whispered something urgently to their attorney. The lawyer gave a slight nod, but his eyes remained fixed on Camille. For the first time since the arrest, Camille held the upper hand. But this wasn't about payback. She reminded herself of that. Her robe wasn't for vengeance, it was for justice. She had sworn to uphold the law, and she would. Still, no one in the room missed the symbolism. As the attorneys began their opening statements, Camille remained focused, taking notes, listening intently. But occasionally, her gaze would drift back to the officers. She noticed their nervous glances, their twitching hands, the stiffness in their shoulders. They weren't just facing the legal system, they were facing the weight of their own actions. During a recess, Carter and Daniels slipped into the hallway, their voices hushed but panicked. How is she the judge? Carter hissed. This has to be a setup, Daniels muttered. It's not, their lawyer snapped. It's a coincidence, and you'd better stay focused. She's not the problem here. Your actions are. But the officers weren't hearing it. The shock of their situation was louder than any advice. When court resumed, Camille returned with the same unwavering presence. She kept the proceedings fair and orderly, but her presence alone continued to rattle the defendants. Every time she addressed them, they stiffened. Their aura of control was slowly unraveling. At one point, during witness testimony, Camille caught Carter looking at her again. But this time, there was no arrogance in his eyes, only regret. By the end of the day, the air in the courtroom was thick with tension. Camille adjourned the hearing with a single firm strike of her gavel. "We'll reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m., she announced. As the room emptied, she stayed behind at the bench, calmly organizing her notes. She could feel them watching her, standing near the exit, hesitating, unsure whether to approach her. But they didn't. They just walked out. Quietly. Heavily. The full weight of their reality finally beginning to settle in. For Camille, the hardest part wasn't that moment. It was knowing that the true test of justice lay in what came next, and the decisions she'd have to make. The next morning, the courtroom was full. Word had spread. This was no longer just a misconduct hearing, it had become a symbol of reckoning. Some people came for the spectacle. Others came to support Camille. Even though they knew she couldn't take sides, her presence alone meant something to them. She entered with the same quiet strength, her robe trailing behind her, and took her seat. The attorneys jumped right in. The prosecutor didn't hold back, laying out evidence, playing witness testimonies, recounting the victim's story in exacting detail. "Your Honor," he said firmly, turning toward Camille, "this wasn't just poor judgment. It was a clear abuse of power. And the officer's actions reveal a pattern, one that can no longer be ignored. They were sworn to protect. But instead, they had become the very thing the public feared." Camille listened intently as the prosecutor spoke, her pen moving steadily across her notepad. She didn't miss a word. Her focus was unshakable, even as the officers at the defense table squirmed beneath her gaze, clearly feeling the weight of her presence. When the defense attorney stood to counter, his voice was calm, but the strain showed. "Your Honor," he began carefully, "we acknowledge that the incident occurred, but the escalation was due to circumstances outside the officer's control. Their intent was never malicious. We believe punitive measures are unwarranted." Camille sat motionless, but inside, she felt a familiar churn. The excuses. The rationalizations. The language of evasion. It mirrored what she had experienced in that park, a moment when assumptions had spoken louder than facts. But she pushed her emotions aside. This wasn't about her. Not now. The law had to lead. Tension filled the courtroom as the prosecutor called his key witness, a young man named Ethan. He walked hesitantly to the stand, his voice shaky as he recalled the night it all went wrong. "It was a routine stop," Ethan said, eyes flicking between the attorneys and the officers. "But before I could even explain, they tackled me to the ground. They never gave me a chance." The prosecutor leaned in. "And did you resist their instructions in any way?" "No," Ethan said firmly, his voice steadier now. "I was terrified. But I did everything they told me. It didn't matter. They'd already decided I was guilty." The room went still. During cross-examination, the defense tried to rattle him, to poke holes in his account, but Ethan didn't waver. Camille watched closely, her face unreadable. But she saw the truth in the young man's eyes. She had lived it. Then came the moment the entire courtroom had been waiting for. The officers, Carter and Daniels, were called to the stand. Carter testified first. He glanced at Camille, and for a split second, his confidence cracked. His voice faltered as he took the oath. "Officer Carter," the prosecutor began, "you're accused of using excessive force. Can you explain what happened that night?" Carter hesitated. He looked to Daniels, then back to the prosecutor. I thought the situation was getting out of control. I made a call in the moment. And do you believe that call was justified?" A pause. Carter shifted in his seat. "At the time, yes. But looking back, I could have done things differently." The prosecutor pressed again. Differently how? By not throwing an unarmed man to the ground without cause? Carter opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. His silence was louder than any excuse. When Daniels took the stand, his answers were defensive, lacking any true self-reflection. His effort to justify their actions only strengthened the case against them. Camille watched with growing frustration, not because of personal bitterness, but because of the sheer waste of authority she saw before her. These men had been given power, and they had misused it. By the end of the day, the courtroom felt heavy with inevitability. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecutor closed with force, calling on the court to send a message that abuse of power would not be tolerated. The defense tried to salvage what they could, but their arguments felt hollow. Even Carter and Daniels seemed to understand what was coming. Camille struck the gavel to end the session. "A ruling will be delivered next week," she announced. Her tone was calm, but final. As people stood and filed out, the two officers lingered at the door, their faces drawn. For the first time, they looked less like enforcers and more like men reckoning with the consequences of their actions. But justice, Camille knew, wasn't about punishment. It was about accountability. It was about the future. A week later, the courtroom was packed. Word had spread. Reporters lined the back wall, pens poised, cameras ready. This wasn't just about two officers anymore, it was about a system. Camille entered the courtroom, robe flowing, face calm. The room fell silent. She began, her voice clear and steady. The role of law enforcement is to protect and serve the community, with integrity, with fairness, and with respect. When that power is abused, it erodes the public's trust and inflicts harm far greater than a single incident. She paused, eyes scanning the room. Carter and Daniels sat with their heads low, no longer able to hide behind their uniforms. The evidence has made it clear, Officers Carter and Daniels used unnecessary force. They ignored their training, broke protocol, and violated the rights of a citizen they were sworn to protect. Their actions reveal a troubling pattern, one that cannot be ignored. Her ruling was decisive. Mandatory suspension without pay. Enrollment in extensive retraining. A formal disciplinary mark on their permanent records. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about change. A message to every officer, every citizen: abuse of power will be met with consequences. She closed the session with a final gavel strike. This court is adjourned. As the officers stood to leave, Carter hesitated. He looked at Camille. "Your Honor," he said softly, "I'm sorry. It wasn't enough." Not nearly. But it was a start. Camille gave him a slight nod, not of forgiveness, but acknowledgement. Because real change doesn't come from apologies. It comes from what you do next. That evening, Camille stood at a community meeting, listening to residents share their stories, their pain, their hope. An elderly woman approached her, gripping her hand. "Thank you," she whispered through tears. "What you did in that courtroom, it meant everything." Camille smiled gently. "This is just the beginning," she said. "There's so much more work to be done." And there was. In the days that followed, the case ignited serious conversations between activists, officers, city officials. Camille used her position to push for real reform, transparency, oversight, better training, and true accountability. Across Fort Collins and beyond, the ripple effect had begun. This wasn't about personal victory. Camille never wanted the spotlight. But if her experience could help fix even a piece of the system, it was worth it. One afternoon, as she watched a group of young activists gather on the courthouse steps for a peaceful rally, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. The system wasn't perfect, but it could be pushed. And that was the kind of justice worth fighting for.